parents sold my inheritance until a $47 million check revealed the truth. My father called it a family meeting. What he really wanted was half of a $47 million check he didn't know I'd already deposited. I drove out to the ranch on a Sunday afternoon in March, past the cattle guard my grandfather welded together in 1974, past the mailbox that's been leaning at the same 40-degree angle since I was in high school, and found my father sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder and a man in a blazer I'd never met in my life. My mother had made a pound cake. Nobody had touched it. My father looked up and said the 6 words I'd been bracing for since he called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning, after almost 4 years of nothing but a birthday text. "We need to talk about the money." He had no idea I already knew exactly which money he meant, or that I'd known for 11 days, or that the check that was about to unravel his whole version of our family had already cleared, sitting quietly in an account he would never be able to touch, no matter what was in that folder. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me tell you about 160 acres my grandfather called the back section, 2 gas wells that hadn't produced a dime since Reagan was president, the actual Reagan, not me, I got the name honest, and a letter that sat in a bank vault in Odell County, Texas for 19 years, waiting for me to be lucky enough or stubborn enough to come find it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for the ones who kept the receipts, who stayed quiet a little too long, and who finally stopped explaining themselves. If that's you, hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see how a title search and a spreadsheet took down 30 years of family mythology. Now let's go back to the actual beginning. Not the kitchen table. Before that, my name is Reagan Hartley. I'm 41. I grew up in Larkspur, Texas, population 1,100, if you count the Gwins who moved out to the county line in 2003 and still get counted because nobody's updated the sign since. My grandfather, Walton Hartley, everybody called him Walt, owned 640 acres about 4 miles outside town. One section, in the old surveying language, the kind of detail you only know if you grew up around people who still measured land the way their grandfathers did. He ran cattle on most of it. Back in the 70s, a landman came through leasing minerals, and 2 wells got drilled on what Walt called the back section, 160 acres set off from the rest, flat and sandy and useless for grazing. Those wells produced for about 6 years, dried up around 1983, and got shut in. Capped. Forgotten. My whole life, that section was just the place with the rusted pump jacks nobody bothered hauling off, because hauling off a dead pump jack costs more than it's worth. My father, Gerald, worked the ranch with Walt and ran a small oil field supply store in town. Pipe fittings, valves, the stuff that keeps a drilling operation running. My mother, Sandra, taught 3rd grade for 11 years before she stepped back to help with the business, which mostly meant answering the phone. My older brother, Colton, was built for that ranch the way some people are built for a specific sport. He could back a horse trailer into a space I couldn't parallel park a sedan into. I was the other one. I liked the back section, not because it was pretty, but because on Saturday mornings, when Colton was at football and my parents were at the store, Walt used to drive me out there to check the gauges on those 2 dead wells, more out of habit than necessity, and he'd let me write the numbers down in a little spiral notebook he kept in his glove box. I didn't understand what the numbers meant. I understood he trusted me to get them right. That's a big thing when you're 9. I don't want to tell you my family was simple back then, easy to sum up in one sentence, because that wouldn't be true. My father wasn't cruel. My mother wasn't cold. They loved their kids sincerely, and also in a way that quietly kept score, who stayed close, who called, who was useful, and who was, eventually, expendable. I left for Texas Tech at 18, geology and business, because I liked rocks and I liked spreadsheets, and nobody in my family understood why those 2 things belonged in the same sentence. I came home for Christmas, for Walt's birthday, for 1/4 of July that ended in an argument about nothing, the way those arguments always start about nothing and end up about everything. I was 22, a semester from graduating, when my grandfather died in his sleep on a Tuesday in October. Heart, the doctor said, just stopped, the way old hearts sometimes do after 81 years of doing their job. The funeral was that Saturday. The Baptist church on Route 40 was full. Walt was well-liked, the kind of man who'd help a stranger change a tire and never mention it again. My mother wore navy. My father didn't cry until the graveside, and even then it was just his jaw working, Nothing you'd call crying unless you'd known him 30 years. The will reading happened 4 days later at the office of Foster Briggs, a lawyer who'd handled Hartley family paperwork since before I was born. It was short. The ranch went to my father, with the understanding, spoken, never written, that it would pass to Colton, since he was the one staying. The supply store, already jointly owned, stayed with my father outright. Then Briggs read a line about mineral interests. 10% of everything Walt owned at death, split among his grandchildren, which at that point meant me and Colton's infant daughter. 5% each. My father made a sound. Not a big one. Just air through his nose, the sound a man makes when he hears a number he doesn't like. In the parking lot afterward, he put his hand on my shoulder and explained it to me the way you'd explain something to a kid, even though I was 22 with a 3.7 in a geology program. Those old wells on the back section haven't produced since before you were born, Reagan. That 5%'s worth about as much as the paper it's printed on. Signing off just simplifies things for the estate. I didn't fight him. Not because I trusted him completely, because I was 22, grieving, and my father had never once in my life been wrong to my face, and questioning him out loud felt like a rebellion I didn't have the stomach for that week. 3 weeks later, I signed a document called Disclaimer of Beneficial Interest, my father standing behind my chair the whole time, and walked out with a check for $11,400, my share, he said, of what the estate could reasonably spare for a college kid's tuition. I found out, 18 years later, that the mineral package, my 5% included, sold to a company called Sabine Mineral Partners 4 months after I signed, for $340,000. I did that math out loud alone, in an empty courthouse annex, and nobody heard me laugh, because it wasn't the kind of laugh you'd want witnessed. That was the first thing. Here's the second, and it's the one that actually mattered, though none of us knew it yet. 2 weeks after the funeral, a certified letter arrived at my parents' house addressed to me, care of Gerald Hartley. It came from Odell County Trust and Savings. My father signed for it. He opened it, because it had my name on it, and I was, in his words later, still living under his roof on paper if not in person. Inside was a 2-page letter explaining that Walton Hartley had, 11 months before his death, established an irrevocable trust, funded by a deed conveying the mineral estate under the back section, that same 160 acres, naming me sole beneficiary, with the bank as trustee, distributions to begin upon commercial production or my 40th birthday, whichever came first. My father read that letter at his own kitchen table. Near as I've been able to piece together, he thought about 2 wells that hadn't produced since 1983, decided the letter described a legal formality attached to worthless dirt, and put it in a drawer. 19 years. 1 drawer. That's all it took. There were other things across those years. The summer I was 26 when Colton needed $40,000 for the store's expansion, and my father asked me to co-sign. And I said no because I just started my first real job and couldn't carry that risk. And my mother told the whole family at Thanksgiving I'd always had trouble showing up for people. There was Colton's wedding toast 2 years later, my father thanking the ones who stayed, without once looking my direction. Small things, the kind that don't end a relationship on their own. They just make you quieter every time you come home, until eventually you stop coming home at all. That's the version of betrayal nobody warns you about. It's rarely one cruel sentence. It's a drawer that stays shut, one ordinary day at a time, until nobody even remembers there was a letter in it to begin with. Quick pause, because I want you to sit with that for a second before we keep going. If you've ever been the one who kept showing up while everyone else quietly kept score, hit subscribe now. The next part is where the paperwork finally catches up with the story. Okay, back to Larkspur. I finished my degree, moved to Midland, took the only job that would have me, file clerk in a title company's land department, sorting decades-old deed abstracts for $9 an hour. I want to tell you I had a plan. I didn't. I had a stubborn refusal to ask my parents for another dollar, which might be the most Hartley thing about me. I married a hydrogeologist named Marcus 4 years later. We met over a waterwell easement dispute, which is either the most romantic story I know or the least, depending who's telling it. We have 2 kids, Owen and Nora, 11 and 8. We live in a subdivision with a xeriscaped yard because nobody out here pays a water bill to keep grass alive that isn't feeding cattle. My career moved the way careers move when nobody's handing you anything. File clerk to landman assistant. Assistant to junior title examiner, 3 years reading 19th century deed language until I could recite habendum clauses in my sleep. Certified professional landman at 34. By 38, I'd started my own shop, Hartley Land Advisory, doing title curative work for operators who needed somebody to untangle 100 years of West Texas paperwork before they'd commit $10 million to a drilling unit. My job, at its core, is finding people. Heirs who moved, widows who remarried, grandchildren nobody remembered to notify when a great-uncle died owning 1/16 of a mineral interest under a wheat field 3 counties over. An operator can't legally pay a royalty to someone it can't locate or verify, so those payments sit in what's called a suspense account, sometimes for years, earning nothing, waiting on somebody like me to build a paper trail solid enough for a title attorney to sign off. I'd built a decent, quiet living doing exactly that. I was not, in March of this year, thinking about my family at all. I hadn't spoken to my father in 11 months, my mother in 4, my brother in about 2 years. Not one dramatic final fight, just the slow tapering off that happens when nobody's fighting to keep something alive. Back in Larkspur, things were going sideways in the way things go sideways for families who measure worth in land and cattle prices instead of anything diversified. The supply store barely survived the 2020 downturn and never fully came back. Colton, who'd taken over the ranch and most of the business by then, had leveraged a piece of the ranch itself against a loan to expand into a second county, a bet that hadn't paid off and was 2 missed payments from the bank sending a certified letter of its own. A phrase that was about to mean something very different to this family than it had 19 years earlier. In February, a client, a mid-sized operator building a 4-well horizontal unit in Odell County, hired my firm to run title on 11 sections south of Larkspur, tract by tract, flagging anything that could hold up a division order once the wells came online. I'd done this job 200 times. Section 14 stopped me cold, not because anything looked wrong, because I recognized the legal description before I finished reading it. Block 3, Section 14, Odell County, Texas, 160 acres out of the northeast quarter. The back section. I hadn't seen those numbers written down since I was 9, copying gauge readings into a spiral notebook in my grandfather's glove box. I did what my job trained me to do instead of feeling anything about it right away. I pulled the full chain of title. The surface, and most of the minerals had passed the way I remembered, through the estate, to my father, a piece sold off to Sabine Mineral Partners in 2008. But there was a reservation I didn't recognize. A mineral deed dated 11 months before Walt died, conveying the non-participating royalty under that 160 acres into something called the Walton J. Hartley Irrevocable Mineral Trust. Trustee, Odell County Trust and Savings. Sole beneficiary, listed by name. Mine. I read it 3 times before I let myself believe it said what it said. Then I did something I'm not proud of and also not sorry for. I didn't call my parents. I called the trust department and asked, in my most professional voice, what it would take for a beneficiary to verify identity. 6 weeks. A notarized affidavit of heirship. A certified copy of my birth certificate. A death certificate for my grandfather I had to request from the state because my own copy had been sitting in a box in my parents' attic since 2007. A call with a trust officer named Priya Malhotra who, once she confirmed my identity, went quiet for a second and said, "Miss Hartley, I need you to sit down if you aren't already." The 2 wells on the back section had been re-drilled horizontally 2 years earlier, folded into a new unit by Cimarron Ridge Energy, a company that had bought the old lease at auction in 2019 without much fanfare, the kind of asset purchase nobody in my family would have noticed. Production had been strong from the start, and because the last address the bank had on file for me was my parents' house from 2007, every royalty payment for 2 years had sat in suspense, accruing, while a division order attorney in Fort Worth periodically failed to locate Reagan Hartley, last known address, Larkspur, Texas. A search that apparently never once checked the state land registry, where my actual name and business address had been sitting in plain sight for 7 years. Priya read me the balance. I made her repeat it. $47,116,842.60. I didn't cry. I want to tell you I did, because it'd make a better story. What actually happened is I sat very still at my desk for about 90 seconds, staring at an unrelated stack of abstracts, and thought, with a flat, exhausted clarity. He knew. My father read that letter 19 years ago and knew, and let me believe Grandpa left me $11,000 and a pat on the head because I was the one who left and Colton was the one who stayed, and somewhere in his head that made it fair. There was one more thing in the file. A sealed letter, held by the bank per the original trust instructions, to be delivered only upon full vesting. Priya mailed it overnight. It arrived Thursday, my grandfather's handwriting on the front, ink faded but steady. I sat in my car in my own parking lot and read it before I let myself go inside. Reagan girl, if you're reading this, it means those two old wells finally did something, or you turned 40, whichever came first, and either way it means you're the one who came looking. I always figured you would. You were the only one who ever wanted to know why the numbers mattered, not just what they were. I put this aside separate from everything else because I didn't want it tangled up in who got the house or who got the cattle. This was never about the ranch. It was about you having something nobody could talk you out of, sell out from under you, or explain away at a kitchen table. Don't feel guilty about the years it sat there. That was never yours to carry. Go build whatever you want with it. Grandpa Walt asterisk. I didn't tell my family. Not out of spite. I genuinely didn't know how, and I needed time to sit with what I now understood about the last 19 years before I could talk about it without my voice shaking. I told Marcus. I told my accountant, and an estate attorney of my own, a woman named Diane Okafor, who spent our first meeting mostly making sure I understood that under Texas law I did not owe my father or my brother $1 of proceeds that had never passed through probate, never belonged to the estate, and never legally belonged to anyone but me. 11 days after the check cleared, my mother called. First one in 4 months. She didn't mention money. She said she and my father had been doing some thinking and wanted me out to the ranch for Sunday dinner, just family, time to mend things. I recognize the phrasing the way you recognize a smell from childhood before your brain names it. She did not mention that 4 days earlier, at Wednesday night Bible study, the county clerk, Carol Jennings, had mentioned to her, friendliest way possible, how wonderful it was to hear about Reagan's good fortune. Everybody down at the courthouse was just tickled. My mother smiled, said something noncommittal, and drove home white-knuckled the whole way. I know because Colton told me later. Colton doesn't lie to me the way our parents do. He just goes quiet, which is its own kind of honesty if you learn to read it. So when my mother called about Sunday dinner, I already knew exactly what kind of dinner it was going to be. I said yes anyway, not out of hope, but because I finally had every piece of paper I needed to have this conversation on my terms instead of theirs. My father said, "We need to talk about the money," and gestured at the folder like it was evidence in a trial. The man in the blazer introduced himself as Dale Whitlow, the family's attorney, off and on for years, which I happened to know meant he did their taxes and occasionally reviewed a lease, not courtroom experience with irrevocable trusts. "Reagan," my father said, "we've been talking, and we think there's a fair conversation to be had. Your grandfather always meant for this family to share in whatever came off this land. That's the spirit of the will." "That's not what the trust says," I said. "It's not what the will says either. The will gave me 5% of the estate's minerals as of 2007. I signed that away at your kitchen table 3 weeks after the funeral for $11,400, while you already knew a separate trust existed naming me sole beneficiary of the back section. You'd read the letter by then. You signed for it. I have the delivery confirmation. I set it on the table. 1 page, Odell County Trust and Savings letterhead, a signature line with my father's handwriting, dated 11 days after the funeral. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Not performance. I've seen my mother perform surprise, and this wasn't it. This was the real thing, the face of someone finding out her husband kept something from her for 19 years too. Colton, standing in the kitchen doorway, said, "Dad, what is she talking about?" Not a question. A demand dressed as one. My father didn't answer him. He looked at me instead, and said the thing that finally, cleanly, told me everything this dinner had been for. You wouldn't even have known to look for it if you hadn't stayed in this business. This town. You owe this family for the life that gave you the tools to find it. I let that sit a second, because I'd learned, in 15 years of untangling other people's inheritances, that the quietest sentence in the room usually lands the hardest. "I don't owe you anything, Dad. I never did. But I'll tell you what I'm not doing, and what I am. I wasn't paying Whitlow's proposed family equity share. I wasn't restructuring the trust, which I told Whitlow directly, watching his face confirm he already suspected as much, is spendthrift and irrevocable under Texas law, immune to exactly the kind of claim he'd driven 40 minutes to make. I wasn't pretending 19 years was a misunderstanding. What I did do, decided 3 days earlier, in Diana Okafor's office, long before I agreed to Sunday dinner, was open my laptop right there at that table and show Colton the payoff balance on the ranch loan his bank had sent notice on 2 weeks prior. $61,400. I told him I'd wire it directly to the lender that Monday, not to him, not to our father, on one condition. The ranch stays titled exactly as it's titled now, no strings, and no future conversation at any kitchen table about the trust ever again. Colton didn't say thank you right away. He just nodded once, the way he does, and looked at our father like he was seeing him for the first time in a while. My father didn't say anything at all. He looked at the folder he'd probably rehearsed opening for a week. He closed it. My mother followed me out to the car. She didn't apologize exactly. I don't think Sandra Hartley has said the actual words, "I'm sorry," in her life without a but close behind them, but she stood in the gravel, arms crossed against the wind, and said, "I didn't know, Reagan. I want you to believe that." I did believe her, mostly, which was its own strange, small mercy I hadn't expected to feel that day. I told her the offer to Colton stood, and I'd sit down with her separately, without Dad, without Whitlow, any time she wanted. She nodded. I drove past the cattle guard my grandfather welded 52 years ago, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I'd finally taken something with me that had been mine the whole time. Colton's loan got paid off that Monday, exactly like I said. He called that night, first real conversation we'd had in 2 years, and told me he was folding the cattle side into a partnership with a neighboring ranch, spreading the risk, something our grandfather used to talk about doing and never got around to. We talk most weeks now. He brought his kids to Midland in June, and my daughter Nora, 8, informed her cousin with total confidence that their great-great-grandfather found oil with a spiral notebook, which isn't exactly true and isn't exactly wrong either. My father called twice over the summer. Both times the conversation drifted, within a few minutes, back toward the trust, toward fairness, some version of a kitchen table argument dressed in different words. Both times I told him the same thing. I love you, and the answer hasn't changed and it isn't going to. He hasn't called since August. I've made my peace, mostly, with the fact that some doors close not because you slammed them, but because the person on the other side only ever knocked when they wanted something, and stopped once they understood you weren't going to give it to them anymore. My mother and I have dinner now, about once a month, at a diner off Highway 87 that has nothing to do with the ranch, or the trust, or any of it. We don't talk about my father much. We talk about Nora's spelling tests and, sometimes, carefully, about what Walt was like in the years before I was born. Stories she's never told me, like she'd been saving them for a version of his conversation she didn't know how to start until now. I set up a small scholarship through the Odell County Farm Bureau last month, in my grandfather's name, for a graduating senior planning to study geology or agriculture. $5,000 a year. Nothing that'll make headlines. I like the idea of some kid out there getting handed something with Walt and Hartley's name on it that nobody could quietly put in a drawer. I've thought a lot, these last few months, about the difference between protecting someone and protecting yourself, because my father would probably still tell you he did both, that keeping that letter in a drawer was a kindness, sparing me years of hoping for something that might never pay off. Maybe some tiny part of that was even true, back in 2007. But a kindness doesn't need 19 years, and a phone call from the county clerk to finally come out. A kindness doesn't wait until it's profitable to become the truth. My grandfather didn't leave me $47 million because he loved me more than he loved my brother or my parents. He left it to me because he trusted me to find it on my own, in my own time, without anybody's permission. He was right to bet on that. He just didn't know it would take 19 years and a stranger's phone call to prove it. If someone in your life stayed quiet about something that could have changed everything, and only found their voice once it started paying off, would you let them back in? Where's the line between forgiving someone and just letting them rewrite the story a second time? Tell me in the comments. And if this one hits somewhere close to home, hit subscribe, because next week's story is about a family that thought silence was the same thing as innocence. It never is.